Hi everybody, welcome to this week's introductory video as we begin our module on Islam. So recall that all three of the Abrahamic faiths share their lineage back to Abraham, and even before that, the creation story of all things, where the one God created the heavens and the earth, created a garden, a perfect garden in which all God's good creatures could reside, including man. Now let's think about the mythos of gardens and why it's represented here within the story as this idyllic state. And man and God and all of creation lived in peace and harmony. If you've been through a garden, you may recall your experience where you may have felt the beauty of the garden. You may have gone to the garden and it helped you relax. It was a place of peace. But it was also, by definition, a place of life. A garden is made up of life, a variety of insects and flowers and trees. It's what we refer to as the place where life flourishes. Now, though we walk through a garden and we say, wow, this garden is peaceful, or I experience peace, or it is so beautiful, that one garden really gets its beauty from the fact that it's comprised of a variety of life. But imagine if the tulips forgot that they were part of the one garden, or imagine if the roses or the lemon tree forgot they were part of the one garden. They might start to worry about whether or not they will be nourished if the other plants were to take up all the good soil or all the nutrients from the same soil. They may start to wonder if they'd be better off trying to get and hoard the rain as opposed to allowing it to fall on the other plants. If they all forgot they were part of the one same garden, they may have forgotten that they all lived amongst each other and needed each other in order to flourish. And in many ways, this describes societies and people too, right? Towards the east of where the Roman Empire would expand Christendom, in Arabia, there would be monotheistic religions too. Judaism would be there, Christianity would be there, but 500 years after Christ, this region in Arabia was mostly polytheistic, lots of gods, and also lots of tribes in tribal warfare, people in conflict trying to hoard goods and gain power and material wealth. They all forgot they were part of the same garden. So it's around this time that Islam begins to arise as a voice, right? Calling out, hey, remember, we are all family. We are all one. We are all under one creator. There's only one source of all that we see around us. There is the God, not several other gods that pull our attention, but the one God. In this sense, we see another way of looking at love, which is also emphasized in Islam, right? In addition to agape that we learned about last class, right, willing the good of the other, we see now love being seen as a uniting force, as a force that brings things together, including harmony within the garden and harmony within God's people. But just think about love just in general. I mean, doesn't love act as a attracting force, as a uniting force in your own life? I mean, when you say you love your partner, isn't that the love that brings you and your partner together, that unifies you? When you say you love your neighbors, I mean, isn't that a unifying force that brings you into closer community with your neighbors? I mean, even something like you loving pizza or you loving the Golden State Warriors, isn't that about you being attracted to those things? You being brought closer to those things? So within the Christian tradition that we saw last week, we can see love in that way too. Love as that force that brings us together in the body of Christ. Within Islam, we're going to see that emphasized because of how all these warring tribes within the region have their own priorities and see each of the other tribes as kind of enemies, and the call towards God's divine love and the fact that we are all created by the one God. We're going to see divine love emphasized as this unifying force to bring us back together. So as we begin our exploration of Islam, to get us started, there are three terms I'd like you to become more familiar with that will help you understand not just this faith, but the other faiths as well. And those terms are going to be prophet, hell, and submission. So let's go ahead and start by taking a look at the word prophet. So when we often think of the word prophet in modern times, we might see in our heads a fortune teller or somebody that can see into the future. But when we take a look at the Greek, the origins of the term, which is from the Greek term prophetis, we see it's referring to spokesperson or interpreter. So within the Abrahamic traditions, like we saw within Judaism, there's these various prophets who were spokespeople for God. And it wasn't as if God couldn't communicate with everybody, but sometimes we just don't listen. Sometimes we just don't adhere to the call. So God is said to have spoken through specific people who are asked to wake us up, to remind us, to draw our attention back to the sort of life God had intended for us back in the garden. You can probably relate to this, as odd as it may sound, right? You've probably heard somebody or been around somebody who seemed to speak truth. And maybe there's a point in your life when you heard somebody that spoke truth and it moved you. It changed the way you look at yourself and your place in the world. Maybe you've heard that voice within yourself, this voice that's calling you towards truth, towards living a certain life. And maybe listening to that voice, you were inspired to make change. Or sometimes maybe that voice is there, but you just ignore it. So, second word is hell. And, the way we often think about it now, the image we have of it, the visual that might pop in our heads, a lot of it stems from a 14th century poet who wrote Dante's Inferno, in which he describes, hell as this burning, fiery place of punishment for those who sinned and were bad people while they were alive, right? It's the place you go after death where you're eaten by fire or devoured by fire and experience anguish and torment forever, right? A lot of that imagery comes from Dante's Inferno from the 14th century. So we're going to take a step back and take a look at various incarnations of this depiction to get maybe a better sense for what or how we could relate to hell from Mythos perspective. Well, it's no wonder that this image of fire is so well associated and placed into Dante's depiction. When we take a look at Islam, the Arabic word that's translated into the English word hell is Jahannam. And within the Holy Quran, the holy scripture for the Islamic faith, there's lots of depictions of hell as being a place of fire. It's definitely the place that one of the places that we could go after death, right? There's going to be an emphasis that there is paradise in the garden. If you lived your life righteously in alignment with God's will, we enter paradise and the garden. But if we live life away from God's wishes, away from the good life He's calling us to live, then we will enter into Jahannam, right? And it's also depicted as a fiery place of torment. But think about the way that's presented to us, right? Here is this force of good, this voice of good that's calling us towards good. If we decide to go against that, well, what sort of life should we expect? So it's not so much about punishment, maybe, though it's sometimes framed that way. In some sense, it's about God, following our wishes, allowing us to live the life we choose. Okay, so let's step back before Islam and take a look at Christianity. Within the New Testament, there's lots of discussion of hell, right? And the English word hell there is usually translated from one of two terms. So remember that the New Testament was written in Greek. So you'd see the word Hades, which is really referring to the Jewish word Sheol, and you'd see the word Gehenna. So in the original Greek text, you'd see Sheol or Hades and Gehenna, and then those would be translated both into hell. Now, Sheol, we know from Judaism, right? Sheol is just the the reference to the place where the dead go. It's the dark place. It's the dark place that you are in after you die. It's not necessarily good, not necessarily bad, right? We recall from our discussion that there wasn't much emphasis on the afterlife in Judaism, and especially about the good and bad place. So Sheol, just the dark place you go after you die. So when that's mentioned in the New Testament, that's translated into hell. But also Gehenna. So when Jesus talks about the type of life we'd experience if we are away from God, the type of life that we'd experience if we continue to sin, he talked about that life being like Gehenna. Gehenna was a place. It was a place outside of Jerusalem where trash would be burned. Just imagine that. Imagine there's a place in the desert where trash would be burned, and Jesus says, if you don't follow God, if you don't repent, right? If you don't experience metanoia, have a transformation, turn around, you're headed towards Gehenna. Can you see the imagery there, the symbolism, that your life would be like a place of burning trash? Think about those two ideas. Or, yeah, the idea of fiery, the idea of burnt trash, this thing that's kind of constant amongst these depictions so far. Think about what fire does. Fire disintegrates things. Fire tears things apart. Fire destroys things. Wouldn't that be a depiction of a life away from goodness? Right? Because when we think of goodness, we think of wholeness usually, of proper health. So hell then, the opposite of goodness, seems to be a place where we fall apart, where we're torn apart. Have you ever experienced that in your own life? I mean, think about how uncomfortable it would be to live in Gehenna. By the way, if you haven't noticed, Gehenna and Jahannam, they're related. Think about living in a wasteland in the desert with burnt trash, how hot it would be, how awful it would be. That's the metaphor for the life away from goodness, away from God. But if you take one more step back to the etymology, right, the roots of the word hell, it comes from words that mean to cover, to conceal, to be hidden. How are all these things related? Well, remember that the good life is one where we're in the presence of God. I mean, think about the garden. It's where we're in the presence of God, in the presence of harmony, in the presence of love, right? Especially divine love. So hell might be referring to us being hidden from that love, being concealed and separated from that love, from that harmony. Have you ever felt isolated? You ever felt alone? Have you ever felt like you were separated from love? You have? Maybe you can relate to the mythos of hell. The third word, and lastly, is submission. And if we think about it in common language, we think of submission as kind of like slavery, right? It's about you giving somebody else authority over you. That doesn't sound like a good thing. In many ways, it's not a good thing. Within the Christian Bible, we actually see a line that refers to wives having to submit to their husbands. And if we take a look at that now from our modern eyes, using our modern definition of submission, that sounds horrible. But of course you can't do that because this text was written 2,000 years ago. So what did this word mean 2,000 years ago? Submission, again, comes from a Greek term, and that Greek term really referred to orderly. It referred to arrangement. And the context it was often in was with military formation, where they would talk about having to arrange the soldiers in a certain way, right, to protect the city, to go into battle, to put things into order with the soldiers so that they're ready to move forward or to defend. So when we talk about submission in this context, we're talking about reordering one's life. And when you enter into a marriage, you have to reorder your life. It's no longer just about you. You now have to reorder it to take into account the needs of your partner. And what's interesting is when people often think about this quote, wives must submit to their husbands, they neglect the line right before it, which talks about how husbands and wives need to submit to each other. So really, this whole idea here of submission refers to how when you enter into a partnership, especially in marriage, you have to reorder your lives in order to make the marriage work, in order to make the marriage healthy, in order to keep it safe, right? You have to reorder your lives to be about the marriage. And this idea, submission, is going to be very important within the Islamic faith, because when we take a look at what it means to be a Muslim, the word literally means submission, and in particular, submission to God. Ordering, arranging your life to remember what's truly important. The story that you'll be exposed to this coming week is about this merchant who is called to be a prophet, to tell all of God's people to remember and to reorder their lives in a certain way to avoid torment and being torn apart by what they currently see as the normal sort of life around them. Now, to get a better sense for the mythos of the Islamic faith, these are the three things that I'd like you to keep in mind as you move from section to section over this week's modules. First is that the ultimate, again, as we've seen with all the Abrahamic faiths, is God. Another way of thinking about the ultimate is the garden, right? Our ultimate nature, the ultimate place that we belong is the garden. That's what the ultimate life is like, the idyllic life. Or in the Holy Quran, you'd hear or read paradise, right? These are often used interchangeably. So it's that sort of life. So you'll get a feel for both of these as you move on our module. The human condition, then, is one of distraction, where we've lost our focus, right? And we are being pulled by various desires and things that we think are important, instead of thinking and focusing on what's truly important. You can also think of the human condition as one of forgetting, because remember, Muhammad is following a line of prophets, right? Jesus before him, Moses before him, Abraham before him, all proclaiming unity under the one God, right? Reminding us that there is a good life that God had intended, but we've just forgotten. So how do we transcend this condition? Well, we transcend it through submission, by reordering our lives to remind us, to refocus our attention on what's truly important. Within the Islamic faith, we're going to pay particular attention to what are often referred to as the 5 pillars of Islam, but these are just foundational, right, behaviors. What's truly maybe of importance is developing a God-centered consciousness, where when we walk and move and breathe and act in the world, we are focused on doing all of that with God in mind, right? With the source of goodness, the source of all creation. It's about paying attention to every moment of our lives with that lens. So, to get us thinking about the mythos of the Islamic faith, I'd like you to answer the following questions in this week's Flipgrid assignment. What fears, activities, desires have distracted you from what you most value in life? Think about your activities and things you occupy your time with, or the things that you do or have done in the past that you go, yeah, I know that probably wasn't really important. It probably distracted me from doing something that I really cared about more. Are there desires that are pulling your attention that you know aren't really that important? Or there are certain fears that you have that are preventing you, that you're so focused on those fears that they prevent you from living the life that you think is meaningful, fulfilling. Another way of saying the same question is what have pulled you apart? What fears, activities, desires have pulled you apart and made it hard for you to experience peace within yourself or peace with other people, right? 2 different ways of saying the same thing. All right? So I wish you well as you begin our module on the Islamic faith.